Welcome to Learn the Word, the daily Bible teaching program of Calvary Chapel of Delta and Pastor Doug McLean. Today, we're continuing our new verse-by-verse study through Ezekiel, beginning in chapter 3, verse 16. So here's part 1 of the message, a serious, dramatic ministry.
When Ezekiel stood, the Spirit entered him, and the Lord told him that he was to speak to the children of Israel, and he told him ahead of time that they were rebellious and stubborn. They were going to be a tough crowd. But he was to speak and not fear. His responsibility was to deliver the message. But first, he had to digest it personally, appropriate it personally. In fact, literally, he was given a scroll and told to eat it. And the Lord let him know that the children of Israel were not going to listen. And the problem wasn't that they didn't understand. The problem was that they didn't want to listen, as it often is. They didn't want to submit. They were stubborn and rebellious. And so Ezekiel was to take the word into his heart, the center of his being, apply it to his life, and then listen for the Lord, and then speak the word. You see, Ezekiel was God's prophet to his people in captivity in that age. And as he went through that experience, he walked away from it knowing that the hand of the Lord was upon him, that God had his hand on him, guiding him, involved in his life, moving him to that point. And it was such a profound experience that we were told in verse 15 of chapter 3 that he sat astonished among the captives for 7 days. Now, before we pick up in verse 16 of chapter 3, it's important to note that there are many things that we see in this book that are very specific to Ezekiel and his ministry, very specific to Ezekiel as God's prophet in that age, that are not specifically directed toward us, but with that said, they do point to or illustrate concepts or lessons about our opportunities and our responsibilities before the Lord. So he's asking Ezekiel to do things that are very specific for him, and they point to lessons that can be applied to our lives, but he's not asking us to do the same things that he asked Ezekiel to do. And you'll see that. If you haven't read ahead, you'll see it and understand what I'm saying as we go through it. So Ezekiel sat astonished among his people for 7 days. He was told that he would speak for the Lord, but the Lord hadn't yet given him the message. And then verse 16 picks up, Ezekiel 3:16. Now it came to pass at the end of 7 days that the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. Therefore, hear a word from my mouth and give them warning from me. Now, this phrase, the word of the Lord came, is found 104 times in the Old Testament. The word of the Lord came. In Ezekiel, it's found 50 times. So almost half the occurrences are in this book of Ezekiel, 21 in Jeremiah, 6 in Zechariah, 5 in Haggai, twice in Jonah, once in Isaiah, and then the rest are spread throughout the historic narrative. But overwhelmingly, 50 of the 104 occurrences the word of the Lord came are found here in the book of Ezekiel. He used this phrase more frequently than any other. And I think you'll see as we go through this why that was so significant to him. I hope you'll see it before the end of our study. So 7 days of waiting, of sitting where the people sat, and then the Lord spoke. He spoke to Ezekiel in his timing. As Ezekiel waited there for direction and waited for the next step. So he was ready to hear, but it was after 7 days that he received the word of the Lord. And I'm reminded as I read this how important it is to wait on the Lord. Because he is able to speak. He's able to give a specific direction. It's so easy for us to get ahead of him It's so easy for us to get so busy to fill our mind and our ears with so many other voices, it can become difficult for us to discern the Lord's voice. We have more information floating around in this age than ever before. And so it's important to wait, to tune in until the Lord speaks. So waiting 7 days, the Lord had this specific word, specific message for Ezekiel, communicating his calling, describing his ministry. And the Lord described Ezekiel's function, his ministry, as being the watchman for the house of Israel. Now, the Lord referred to Jeremiah's ministry in a similar way as a watchman in Israel in Jeremiah 6:16-21. Jeremiah 6:16-21. So it's an appropriate picture of a prophetic ministry. The watchman, we know historically, is mentioned several times in the Old Testament. 1 Samuel 14, you meet the watchman of Saul. 1 Samuel 14. In 2 Samuel 13 and 2 Samuel 18, 2 Samuel 13, 2 Samuel 18, you'll see the watchman of David, or for David. And then in 2 Kings chapter 9, 2 Kings chapter 9, there's the watchman at Jezreel. So you get this picture, if you were to read through the historic accounts, that the watchman was like a lookout for the city. He was typically stationed on the wall or on some high vantage point, and he was given the responsibility of looking out on the horizon, keeping watch out for any potential threats to the city. And if he saw any danger coming, it was his responsibility to alert the city. So the safety of the city depended on the watchman. He was responsible. So he had to stay awake. Of course, they would be on shifts. There are different watches they would have, but the watchman had to be awake, he had to be alert, he had to keep his eyes open, he had to pay attention. Now, we're going to see this develop further in chapter 33. The Lord goes into more details in chapter 33. This is Ezekiel's initial call, his initial charge. Ezekiel, you are the watchman. And specifically, he was to hear a word from the Lord's mouth and give them warning. So a city's watchman would be looking out on the horizon, looking for potential threats. Ezekiel was a watchman, but in a slightly different way. He had to be tuned into what the Lord was saying, and he would have to then speak what the Lord was saying as the Lord was bringing different events into Israel, into the lives of the children of Israel. We'll talk more about that before we close. Look at verse 18. The Lord continued, "When I say to the wicked, you shall surely die, and you give him no warning, nor speak to warn the wicked from his wicked way to save his life, that same wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at your hand." Now, throughout this section, when he speaks of the wicked, that's singular. That's talking about a wicked person, a wicked man. The wicked could be translated guilty. It's a person that's unquestionably doing wrong. Not necessarily maniacal, but certainly they've violated the law. They're unrighteous, evil, somebody that's guilty of some offense against God or man. So the Lord was saying to Ezekiel, when I say to a guilty man, to one singular guilty man, you're going to die, if you don't say anything to him, to give him an opportunity to repent or change, he's still going to die, and you're going to be responsible. Now that's heavy. Don't you think? That's heavy. So the wicked man wouldn't be absolved from his guilt. Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. That's what sin leads to, death, and the second death. And certainly we know that every man's conscience Every man in his conscience has a knowledge of right and wrong. So there's already that testimony. And every man is responsible for his sin. But on top of that, the Lord said to Ezekiel, not only will he pay, but if you don't say anything, you're going to pay as well. You're going to be responsible for your failure to warn him. And he continued in verse 19, and he said, yet if you warn the wicked, and he does not turn from his wickedness, nor from his wicked way, he shall die in his iniquity. But you have delivered your soul. So the Lord said, your job is to deliver the warning. And the wicked man is responsible for his response to the warning. And again, this is every individual is responsible for how they respond to the warning. Ezekiel was responsible to give the warning, and then the wicked man had to respond to that warning individually. And if Ezekiel simply delivered the warning, the Lord said, you will deliver your soul, just by warning. Regardless of how the wicked responded, regardless of how the wicked received or rejected, that wasn't primary. It was simply give the message and you will deliver your soul. Now, don't get this confused. This is not God's plan of salvation for Ezekiel. This is not, hey, Ezekiel, if you want to get saved, deliver the message. And the context of the rest of the Bible forbids that understanding. When you get to Galatians 2:16, by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified. No flesh can be saved by our efforts, our works. Understand the soul is a word in the Old Testament that's used to describe the inner self, the immaterial part of man. So that involves a man's thinking, his will, his feelings, his desires, his emotions. So failing to warn, failing to deliver the message would certainly have consequences in Ezekiel's life. He would have guilt, he would have doubt, he would have regret, he would have sorrow. There were things that would come to his soul if he failed to deliver the warning. Verse 20 continues, again, when a righteous man turns from his righteousness and commits iniquity, and I lay a stumbling block before him, he shall die because you did not give him warning. He shall die in his sin, and his righteousness which he has done shall not be remembered, but his blood I will require at your hand. So here, in contrast to the wicked man, we have the righteous man, and that would be the just man, the blameless man, not perfect, but this is describing a man of faith, a man who is responding to conviction typically, a man who would regularly confess his sin and turn from them. And the Lord saying to Ezekiel, if that man commits some iniquity, some sin, some wrong or evil, and then God puts a stumbling block in front of him, which is fascinating, because God does that. He puts obstacles in people's path, particularly believers' paths. Why? To help believers see that they've gotten off track. He's just faithful. He doesn't make it easy to drift. He doesn't make it easy to backslide. He puts things that will get in the way, so you have to hop over them or you have to push through them. Because the Lord loves, he'll put things in a man's path. If he's choosing a destructive path, if there's bad down the road, he's going to put some obstacles in the way to keep you from ending up there. But notice, even with that, Ezekiel had the responsibility to warn the righteous man who had committed sin and was getting tripped up, because he was supposed to speak for the Lord to help this man see his need before it was too late for him. And notice, in this old covenant, he's saying that the righteous man could not be justified by his past works of righteousness. And in addition, Ezekiel would be held responsible for his failure to warn. And again, very heavy here. Verse 21, nevertheless, if you warn the righteous man that the righteous should not sin, and he does not sin, he shall surely live because he took the warning. also you will have delivered your soul. So here you see this warning ministry can have a good result. There's positive to it, that life can be preserved. Now, in looking at this, no doubt, it's a very serious ministry, a very important role for Ezekiel as God's prophet. And again, he wasn't responsible for the response of those he warned, but rather he was responsible to warn. And although we don't have that particular charge, we do have a similar responsibility, and that is to speak the truth in love. It's really our responsibility in this age to communicate the gospel to the world around us. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2, 2 Timothy 4:2, Paul told Timothy, preach the word, be ready in season and out of season. He said, convince, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and teaching. So there was responsibility. And sometimes that has to be a sharp rebuke even. Titus chapter 1, verse 13, rebuke him sharply. Titus chapter 1, verse 13. So sometimes that has to happen. It always has to be with humility. 2 Timothy 2:25 tells us that. 2 Timothy 2:25. And I think James chapter 5, 19-20 is appropriate. James 5, 19-20 says, brethren, if anyone among you wanders from the truth, and someone turns him back, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his way will save a soul from death and cover a multitude of sins. So it's commended. This is a good thing to try to turn people back, to try to turn people to the Lord, to communicate the truth. Again, we can't make someone respond. We're just communicating the truth. Colossians 1:28. Colossians 1:28 says, of Christ, him we preach, warning every man and teaching every man in all wisdom, that we may present every man perfect in Christ. So there's that general calling for all of us. Now, if you have a specific calling, like Ezekiel, there's greater responsibility. So we have a general calling, and then people can have a specific calling, like Ezekiel or like Paul. Remember, Paul had a very specific calling, and he wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 16, 1 Corinthians 9:16, he said, for if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of. He says, for necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe is me if I don't preach the gospel. So Paul had this specific calling to preach the gospel. He said, if I do this, it's not like I'm doing anything special. I'm doing what I'm called to do. And if I don't do it, then woe is me. So he had a very specific calling. You can see this work through his life. When he was in Corinth, for example, he went to the synagogue first, and he was, Acts chapter 18, trying to teach in the synagogue, and he was running into resistance from his own people, and he got to a place, Acts 18, verse 6, where he actually said, listen, he said, your blood be on your own heads, and from now on I'm going to go to the Gentiles. Acts 18, verse 6. He felt like he discharged his duty. He said what he needed to say, and now they were responsible to that truth. Later on, in Acts 20, 26-27, he had all the elders of the church at Ephesus come and meet him at Miletus, and he was there, and he knew that he wasn't going to see them again. And as he was addressing those church leaders, he said in Acts 20, 26-27, he said, therefore I testify to you this day that I am innocent of the blood of all men, for I have not shunned to declare to you the whole counsel of God. So he was able to say, look, I delivered the message, I communicated the truth, and I've discharged my duty. When you have a specific calling from the Lord, very serious, weighty responsibility that you have to him. You're not responsible for the response, but just to deliver the message. So the Lord said to Ezekiel, look, this is your role, to hear from me, to warn the people. And again, the difference in Ezekiel's role is he was to have his eyes fixed on what? The Lord. And to listen for what the Lord said, and then communicate to the people. A typical city watchman is looking at the horizon and looking for all the armies of the world coming, and to warn the city about the armies of the world. Okay, and I know that sometimes this prophecy about a watchman on the wall, or the word about a watchman on the wall, people use that to say, oh, we have to watch for all the threats and we have to warn everybody about all the threats. That's not what is being said here in the context. The context is saying you have to be tuned in to the Lord and communicate his warnings to his people. So it's a vertical ministry, not a horizontal ministry primarily. You're hearing from the Lord, then you're delivering to the people. You're not assessing all the difficulties and giving people warnings about the threats of the armies of the world. Do you understand? So Ezekiel continued in verse 22. He said, then the hand of the Lord was upon me there, and he said to me, arise, go into the plain, and there I shall talk with you. So having received the calling, Ezekiel sensed the Lord's hand again. He knew, whenever you see, he says, the hand of the Lord is upon me, he has the sense that the Lord guided me here, he brought me here, I'm connected with him, and he's just realizing that, yeah, the Lord has me here. His hand's been on me. I didn't just end up here. But the Lord has had his hand on me all the way. And so the Lord then gives him this clarity, this direction. He says, go out away from the people, go into the plain, and there I'm going to talk to you. And ministry happens that way at times. He will direct his servants to draw away, to go away, to get alone. Remember Paul, after he was called by the Lord, Galatians chapter 1, 16 and 17, it says that he went and he spent some time in Arabia before he went back to Damascus. He had some time alone with the Lord to receive from the Lord before he went out into ministry. Galatians 1, 16 and 17. Of course, Jesus in his ministry would draw away and go and spend time with the Father to pray, and then he would come back and minister. And here you see Ezekiel learning that. Come out to the plain and I will talk to you. So this was the next step for Ezekiel. And so he said in verse 23, so I arose and went out into the plain, and behold, the glory of the Lord stood there like the glory which I saw by the river Chebar, and I fell on my face. Now that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Because it's happening again. This is chapter 1 all over again. He gives a summary here. He says it happened like it happened before. And he does the same thing. He falls on his face. Now look, Ezekiel went in simple obedience, and again he beheld the glory of the Lord. He did like he did in chapter 1, and again he fell on his face like he did in chapter 1, verse 28. And again, this is the Lord's preparation, his confirmation, his affirmation after giving him his assignment, which he knew that Ezekiel would need. Now, notice, Ezekiel in no way sought this experience. He wasn't an experience seeker, but the experience came as he sought simple obedience. So there's this objective part of our faith, and there's a subjective experience of our faith. We have the objective truth that never ever changes, the truth of the gospel, and then we have our subjective experience where we're coming into an experience with Christ personally, and you can see that here Ezekiel has the truth, and then he has this experience again with the Lord, but it's not that he's seeking the experience, he's seeking to respond to the objective truth that's been revealed to him as he just walked in obedience. So there's those aspects of Christianity. God hasn't changed. Your best opportunity to experience more of the Lord in your life is simple obedience. Just simple obedience. It's not through a worship service. I love worship, but and sometimes the Lord's presence will be felt there. But the best opportunity to experience the Lord's presence is simple obedience. Jesus said it this way, John 15:14. John 15:14, he said, "You are my friends if you do whatever I command you." Friends with the Lord. It's a great experience. When asked about how Jesus would manifest himself to the disciples and not to the world, Jesus said in John 14:23, he said, "If anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come and make our home with him." So again, it's simple obedience by faith. If you want to have a deeper experience, a greater realization of God's presence, that's the key.
As we learn God's Word and obey Him, we get the privilege of a deeper relationship with Him. And that's why we're so glad you've joined us today to learn God's Word with Pastor Doug. If you'd like to listen to more Bible teaching like this, you can find all of Pastor Doug's teachings from Genesis to Revelation on the Calvary Chapel of Delta mobile app. It's free and easy to use. Just go to your app store and search for CC Delta to download and start listening. And as always, be sure to come back next time as we continue to learn the Word.